Wait before you scroll. This isn't just a love story, it's a journey with a last-minute revelation that ties every thread. Watch the video until the end so you can hear the final words that give the story the meaning it deserves.
Chapter 1. The Library and the Laughter.
There are first meetings that make themselves at home in memory. On a late autumn afternoon at Pembroke College, where brick buildings keep secrets like old friends, he first saw her. Graham Whittaker walked into the library to escape the wind and found Elena Maris behind the circulation desk, sleeves rolled, hair clipped up with a pencil, eyes steady enough to mend a torn book with just a look. He was the son of a family whose name adorned a wing of the museum and half the city's winter fundraisers. She balanced 2 jobs and a scholarship, arranging her days with the precision of a musician tuning to A. He asked for an atlas. She handed him a smile that said he probably needed directions to something else. He pretended to be impervious to her wit. She pretended not to notice how he lingered. The atlas sat there, thick as destiny. Their conversation leaped across it, geography to poetry, hometowns to favorite soups. Beneath the fluorescent hum, he laughed at himself in a way he rarely did in drawing rooms. She laughed like someone who had learned to fold joy into narrow hours and let it rise. A man who has watched the years will tell you that beginnings often hide in inconveniences. A pen that won't write, a drafty door, a request for an atlas. That day, 2 lives took a step that neither fully marked then. They slipped, almost without knowing, into a cadence that would measure their days.
Chapter 2. 2 Worlds, 1 Winter.
Graham came from rooms where voices softened when the butler entered and where apologies were delivered by invoices. Elena came from a street where cars whispered when the mechanic was happy and laughter traveled through vents with the smell of cumin and soap. He brought her to a hockey game, a ritual in his crowd, where he explained rules more complicated than they looked. She brought him to the ice rink behind the public school, where children in mismatched mittens outskated the cold. He stumbled, a prince out of practice. She gripped his glove with the bravado of someone who had learned to make a stage of any patch of light. They walked in loops for hours, talking about careers like they were recipes. He said he'd study law. There was a plan laid out for him like a red carpet rolled down a marble stair. She said music spoke to her, but bills needed her to speak back. He liked her unvarnished truth. She liked that he didn't arrive in life with only polished doors. One night, he took her to a gala under chandeliers that threw diamonds across glassware. Eyes followed her like clocks. She refused to shrink, but he could tell how the room pressed against her. Another night, she took him to a family dinner, where a teapot stood in like an extra grandmother and everyone talked at once. He ate too much and listened to stories at a table that made room simply by pulling it closer. They fell in love the way winter sneaks in. Gradually, then all at once, layers of warmth added until the cold had fewer places to touch. When Elena played the violin at a December recital, Graham sat in the back row and heard the year explain itself. He recognized, in her bow's sweep, a courage that made his own ambitions look smaller if he didn't carry them with care. Chapter 3. The Door That Wouldn't Open.
Trouble arrive swearing good intentions.
Graham's father scheduled a conversation that was really a verdict delivered in the language of favors. The elder Whittaker had built empires out of forecasts and could read numbers like music. He misread Elena as an equation with too many unknowns. He spoke about legacy, about circles one does not step out of without muddying the carpet. He offered Elena a check in a polished envelope, a way to rewrite the scene as a wise detour rather than a refusal. She returned the envelope, and with it the idea that love could be purchased back into a safer column. Her voice didn't rise. It clarified. She told him she was not a test, and Graham was not a variable. The father left without slamming doors. That's the sign of money. Doors close themselves quietly. They married at a courthouse, where light fell indifferently and beautifully on everyone. Graham wore the suit his father had bought but no longer paid for. Elena wore a dress she'd hemmed herself in a borrowed mirror. Their vows were short like the truth. He was cut from the accounts by nightfall. She kissed the red mark money's absence left and called it a beginning. They found an apartment above a bakery, where morning arrived with fresh bread and relief. She coached children in a community music program. He waited tables at a place where he could also study between shifts, the law text spread open like a stern meal. They learned the choreography of small spaces. How to pass each other with jokes, how to forgive burned rice, How to turn fear into a list on the fridge and tackle one item at a time. Love was not an escape from the world. It was the courage to stay and face it together. Chapter 4. The diagnosis in the snow. Years pass even in small apartments. They hang themselves in curtains and make new stains. Graham advanced through casebooks and into late-night arguments with invisible judges. Elena saved for a graduate program she couldn't yet attend, finding fulfillment in teaching wrists how not to grip the bow like fear. They tried to welcome a child into their home's drafty corners. When months turned into hard, watching time rather than counting it, they sought answers. A doctor spoke with the language of caution, then another with the language of tests. In the end, the one with the softest voice delivered the hardest sentence. A rare blood illness, the kind that sits down and refuses to be moved by polite conversation. The doctor told Graham first, in an office where dust made halos in the lamplight. The weight of it didn't arrive like a meteor but like snow, relentless, quiet, covering everything. He walked home through an early storm, a man dragging a sky behind him. He tried to push the news behind his teeth until he could comb its shape, but Elena watched his silence tremble. She had been listening to music's rests her whole life. She heard what he wasn't playing. When he told her, she leaned against the fridge with a hand on the list they'd made, as if she could add it to the bottom and check it off by spring. Her first question was practical. When do we start? Because that's how the brave behave when terror shows up late for dinner. Her second was specific. What can we afford? Because bills do not pause for tragedies they don't understand.
Chapter 5. Borrowed light.
The city hospital watched them arrive like so many others, with a bag too hopeful and a gaze too steady. Treatment began with fluorescent mornings and ended with evenings that smelled like antiseptic and distraction. Elena made friends with nurses by learning their children's names. Graham learned how coffee could be an apology when words fell apart. He needed money that lives refused to wait politely for. He stood again at his father's door, not as a prodigal but as a husband who understood that pride can be a leash. The butler had not aged at all. Time avoids certain hallways. His father received him like a shareholder accepts an emergency motion, businesslike and with relief masked as critique. The terms were simple. The money would be given, not lent, though the ledger in the older man's head would not forget. Graham left with a check folded into his coat and a resolve stored like a secret in the lining. Elena would never know the source. But secrets leak. Love hears their dripping. Elena found the folded deposit confirmation that didn't match their accounts. She waited to ask until after the nurse adjusted the four, until the hallway quieted. He told her the truth, not because she demanded it, but because lies would have made her sicker. She touched his cheek, a grace he did not think he deserved, and said that sometimes stubbornness pretends to be integrity. They agreed to treat the money like rain. They hadn't ordered the weather, but it had arrived and could help the harvest. In small joys they took shelter. Between appointments they sat in parks with thermoses, naming clouds after operas. He read law summaries aloud in a ridiculous courtroom voice. She graded the performance. On good days she played, softly, the notes hovering in the room like birds that knew not to land. On bad days the bow stayed in its case and they watched old movies on a dented laptop, finding in the script the optimism of people who think scenes can be rewritten. Chapter 6. Spring on Loan. A remission arrived like sun through blinds, thin but warming. They drove to the coast in a borrowed car with a radio that only worked when aimed at the ocean. Elena wanted to teach Graham a lullaby from her grandmother's village, for a child they might never hold. He wanted to memorize it anyway, the way one studies a star map even if clouds are predicted. They ate cherries on a pier and let the gulls judge them. In a narrow chapel by the harbor, a quartet rehearsed. Elena asked if they could sit in the back for a minute. The music was more fragile than glass and yet held their weight. Graham watched her eyes close, not in denial but in arrival. He thought of the winter they had outwitted together, of the mornings when she woke before her alarm to make coffee for them both, of the smile that could make him reconsider anger and trade it for patience. Love, a man learns if he is lucky, is not an account you balance. It is whether you share. Back home, his law exams approached, and he feared the mind's betrayal by the body's exhaustion. She insisted he sit with his outlines while she slept. She had begun to measure sleep like music, in movements. Between them was an agreement that did not need to be said. They were each other's argument in favor of hope. Spring, however, is not always generous. The tests returned, not with thunder but with arithmetic that could not be rearranged. The doctors mentioned options in the careful voice people use when time has narrowed.
Something in the room tilted.
They walked out into a rain that turned their clothes honest, and he held her like a harbor teaches its ships. Firm, because the current is not polite. Chapter 7. What remains after the song? Her last weeks were a series of smaller rooms. Visitors came like seasons, bringing oranges, knitting, and stories they had saved for better times and decided these counted. Graham's father visited once, then again, as if he were experimenting with humility like a new instrument. In the presence of the inevitable, men make choices about who they will be after. Elena grew quieter, not because she had less to say, but because life's last answers resist being spoken. She asked Graham to bring the violin. On a day with thin sunlight, she played a simple piece with pauses that stretched like bridges across water. He realized then that silence was part of the melody all along. She stopped not at the final bar but half a beat before, as if to leave room for what comes next. She told him to finish school, to forgive himself for any fragment of this he had decided was his fault, to visit his father on Sundays without turning it into penance. She said he should keep their apartment for a while, even if the rooms echoed, because echoes teach courage. He promised, and for once the word promise did not feel like a risk but a rope. When the end arrived, it chose a calm hour. She exhaled as if setting down a bag at the end of a long trip. He held her hand until its temperature matched the room and then longer still. The nurses moved with practiced kindness, making space for grief to breathe. At some point the hallway clock coughed up a minute he would remember forever. Graham walked out into a city smoothed by rain. His father was waiting on the steps, hat in hand, a man stripped of his armor by weather. For a moment they were neither magnate nor son, just two human beings holding what had been taken from them by the same sky. The older man began an apology that melted as it formed. Graham stopped him gently. He said there was nothing to repay. There was only the task of carrying forward what had been given freely. In another life he might have taken pride in such a sentence. Now it was simply true. They stood together until the rain decided it had said enough. Years later, when this tale is told by a man who has watched a number of winters, what remains are not the hospital rooms or the checkbook shame or even the courthouse vows. What remains is the sound of Elena's bow skating across the air the first time he heard her play, and the way two people made a home out of a small apartment and a huge intention. The rest of us do well to learn. Love does not keep score, it keeps vigil. If this story moved you, please subscribe to the channel, activate notifications, give the video a like, leave a comment with your favorite moment, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that love keeps vigil.